Tonight's story takes us down winding roads, across bustling cities, and into quiet villages, because we're exploring how one invention didn't just change transportation, but quietly transformed almost every part of modern life, the car. Settle in, get comfortable, and let your mind drift as we trace the story of humanity on wheels. Let's start with a thought experiment. Imagine for a moment that cars didn't exist. No engines humming on the highway, no traffic lights glowing at intersections, no long road trips with snacks and music. In their place would be horses, bicycles, and perhaps the occasional steam-powered carriage. Your commute to work might take hours, not minutes. Goods would move more slowly, neighborhoods would be smaller, and the idea of sprawling suburbs simply wouldn't exist. In short, the world we know today would be unrecognizable. The car didn't just give us speed, it gave us entirely new ways to live. The funny thing is, when the first cars appeared, many people didn't take them seriously. They were expensive, noisy, unreliable, and often slower than a good horse. Pedestrians mocked them, farmers cursed them, and city councils worried about accidents. In fact, in the late 19th century, Britain had a law that required a man to walk in front of an automobile waving a red flag to warn people that one was coming. Not exactly the sleek image of freedom and mobility we associate with cars today. And yet, from these awkward, clumsy beginnings, cars slowly took root, reshaping human life in ways few could have predicted. Before we dive deeper, let's sketch the journey ahead. Tonight, our story will unfold in several parts. We'll begin, as we are now, with life before cars and why this invention mattered so profoundly. Then we'll explore the early struggles, the strange experiments, rival inventors, and the messy breakthroughs that finally made cars practical. After that, we'll step back and imagine the world before versus after the arrival of cars, looking at how ordinary people's lives were transformed. Then we'll trace how cars spread across the globe, weaving themselves into every culture and economy. We'll reflect on their modern legacy, what cars mean today, how they've shaped cities, industries, and even our sense of identity. Finally, we'll close with the present day, where cars continue to evolve into something new entirely. But first, let's go back. What was life like before the car? For thousands of years, transportation was dictated by muscle, whether human or animal. People walked. They carried loads on their backs or strapped them to donkeys, oxen, camels, or horses. A wealthy merchant might have a carriage, but even then, the speed was modest and the range limited. Roads were often muddy, rough, or barely more than trails. To travel a long distance was a serious undertaking. A journey of 100 miles could mean several days of travel. This slowness shaped society. Towns and villages were relatively self-contained because it was simply too difficult to move goods or people quickly over long distances. Cities grew, but their boundaries were tighter, clustered around ports or rivers that offered easier transportation. To be wealthy often meant being close to the center of commerce, because living far away meant being isolated. The very geography of human life, where we lived, where we worked, how far we could dream of traveling, was all dictated by the limits of muscle and the speed of hooves. And then came the 19th century, a time of restless invention. Steam power had already revolutionized shipping and trains. Suddenly, distances that once took weeks by horse-drawn carriage could be crossed in days. People marveled at the speed of locomotives, their pistons pumping and smokestacks belching clouds of soot as they thundered across the countryside. But trains, for all their wonder, ran only where tracks were laid. They were powerful, but they weren't flexible. The dream of inventors became something more personal, a vehicle that could go wherever a person wished, whenever they wished, without waiting for a schedule or a rail line. The earliest attempts at building horseless carriages were almost comical. In the late 1700s, Nicolas Joseph Cugnot, a French engineer, built a steam-powered vehicle meant to haul cannons. It was bulky, loud, and so unstable that it once famously knocked down a wall. Later inventors tried clockwork mechanisms, compressed air, even giant wind sails mounted on carriages. None were practical, but all carried the same spark, the idea that humans might move faster, freer, with the help of a machine. By the late 1800s, that dream started becoming reality. The invention of the internal combustion engine, a machine that could turn fuel into controlled explosions and motion, changed everything. Suddenly, vehicles didn't need rails, rivers, or animal power.
They could be self-contained, flexible, and portable. Still, these early cars were clumsy. They broke down constantly, scared horses, and terrified pedestrians. For many, they seemed more like dangerous toys for the rich than a serious tool for ordinary people. And yet, beneath the noise and smoke, something profound was happening. For the first time, the possibility of individual mobility, true personal freedom of movement, was within reach. It may not have been obvious in those rattling contraptions, but the seeds were planted for a revolution that would ripple outward into every part of life. Think for a moment about why cars mattered so much. They didn't just replace horses. They fundamentally altered human experience. The car collapsed distances. It turned journeys that once took days into trips of hours. It redefined where people could live, how far they could work from home, where businesses could reach customers, and where families could spend their leisure time. It changed courtship, family life, and even romance. Suddenly young couples could escape the watchful eyes of parents by driving out into the countryside. It also redefined our relationship with time itself. The pace of life quickened. The world shrank. But perhaps most importantly, the car became more than a machine. It became a symbol. Even in its earliest days, it represented independence, adventure, and modernity. To own a car wasn't just to have transportation, it was to have control. It was to say, I can go where I want, when I want. This emotional power explains why, even long before cars were practical for the masses, they captured the imagination of the world. And it wasn't just individuals who would be transformed. The car would quietly, almost invisibly, reshape entire landscapes. Cities would spread outward, roads would carve into countryside, and economies would reorganize around mobility. But those are stories for later sections. For now, in these early days, the car remained a fragile dream, a noisy, unpredictable contraption still trying to prove it could be more than a passing fad. As you relax into the rhythm of this story, picture those first automobiles rattling down cobblestone streets. Imagine curious children chasing after them, dogs barking, farmers scowling, and pedestrians stepping aside in annoyance. The world didn't yet know that these odd machines, awkward as they were, would become as common as shoes, as essential as houses, as invisible as the air we breathe. And so, tonight's journey truly begins here, with those early sparks of invention and the question that hovered in the air: could the car ever be more than a novelty? Could it really transform life? The answer, as we'll see, is not just yes, it would transform almost everything. If you've ever driven down a smooth highway at 70 miles per hour with the radio playing and the air conditioner humming, it's hard to imagine just how fragile and uncertain the car's beginnings really were. The road to the modern automobile was paved, quite literally, with breakdowns, smoke, failure, and more than a little ridicule. Cars didn't arrive fully formed, they stumbled into existence, the product of hundreds of experiments, rivalries, and small breakthroughs strung together across decades. Let's rewind to the mid-1800s. Steam was the reigning king of power. Steamships crossed oceans, steam locomotives stitched continents together, and inventors naturally wondered, why not steam cars? For a while, they tried. Early steam carriages puffed and hissed their way along roads, sometimes with impressive speed. In the United States, inventors like Sylvester Roper and Francis Stanley built steam-powered cars in the 1860s and 1890s. The Stanley Brothers' Stanley steamer even became something of a legend, reaching speeds that could rival trains. But steam cars had a big problem. They were heavy, required long warm-up times, and demanded constant water and coal. They worked best in demonstrations, less so in everyday life. Meanwhile, others experimented with electricity. Believe it or not, electric cars were once at the forefront of innovation. In the late 19th century, in cities like London and New York, electric taxis quietly zipped around while gasoline-powered cars were still noisy, smelly, and unreliable. By 1900, in fact, electric cars made up about one-third of all vehicles on American roads. They were quiet, clean, and easy to operate, perfect for city driving. But batteries were heavy and limited in range. Once you ran out of charge, you were stuck, and the world didn't yet have charging networks. Without the infrastructure to support them, electric cars struggled to compete outside of urban areas. Then came the gasoline engine, the middle child of automotive history that ended up becoming the star. The internal combustion engine had been tinkered with for decades, but it was Carl Benz, a German inventor, who put the pieces together. In 1886, he built the Benz patent motor wagon, widely considered the first true automobile. It had 3 wheels, looked more like a glorified tricycle than a car, and was powered by a small gasoline engine. On paper, it wasn't impressive. But in practice, it was revolutionary, a self-propelled vehicle that could go wherever roads, or dirt paths, allowed. Still, even this invention might have languished in obscurity without a remarkable act of confidence by someone often left out of the story, Bertha Benz, Carl's wife. In 1888, without telling her husband, Bertha took the motor wagon on a 66-mile journey to visit her mother, becoming the first person to drive an automobile over a long distance. Along the way, she had to stop at pharmacies for fuel, which was basically cleaning fluid at the time, hire a blacksmith to fix broken chains, and improvise repairs with her hat pins and garters. It was a wild adventure, but it proved something crucial: the automobile wasn't just a machine. It was practical transportation. Bertha's drive turned the motor wagon from a curious contraption into a vision of the future. While the Benzes were tinkering in Germany, across Europe and America, other inventors were working feverishly. Gottlieb Daimler and Wilhelm Maybach developed high-speed gasoline engines that would become the basis for motorcycles and cars. In France, Armand Peugeot and Émile Levasseur advanced car design with innovations like the steering wheel. In America, inventors like Charles and Frank Duryea built some of the first gasoline-powered cars in the 1890s. Rivalries sprouted everywhere. Each inventor believed their design was the future, and for a time, nobody was certain which would win: steam, electric, or gasoline. But invention is only half the story. The other half is adoption. And adoption requires affordability, reliability, and mass appeal. This is where the true breakthrough of the car story lies, not just in mechanical invention, but in production and distribution. And that's where Henry Ford enters. Ford didn't invent the car, despite the myth. What he did invent, or perfect, really, was a system that made cars accessible to ordinary people. In 1908, he introduced the Model T. It wasn't the first car, nor the fastest, nor the fanciest. But it was simple, durable, and relatively affordable. Farmers could use it on rough dirt roads. Mechanics could repair it with basic tools. Families could rely on it for everyday travel. Suddenly, the car wasn't just for tinkerers, aristocrats, or the adventurous few. It was for everyone. And then came Ford's true stroke of genius, the moving assembly line. Introduced in 1913, it transformed car production from a slow, artisanal craft into a fast, industrial process. Cars could now be built in hours instead of days. Costs plummeted, prices dropped, and the dream of car ownership spread rapidly. In a way, Ford's assembly line was as revolutionary as the car itself. It pioneered mass production methods that rippled into every other industry, from appliances to electronics. But getting to this point wasn't smooth. Early cars were fragile. Tires burst constantly, engines overheated, and roads were often little more than mud tracks. People were skeptical. Some mocked the horseless carriage as a fad. Others worried about safety. Speed limits in many cities were set as low as 8 or 10 miles per hour. Horses panicked at the sight of cars, and accidents were common. City governments scrambled to figure out how to regulate this new menace. Insurance companies, too, suddenly had to grapple with the idea of auto insurance. And then there were the inventors themselves, locked in a race not just of technology, but of ego. Thomas Edison, for example, championed electric cars, even working with Henry Ford for a time on battery-powered designs. But gasoline engines improved faster than batteries, and by the 1910s, the gasoline car had pulled ahead. The irony is striking. Edison, one of history's great inventors, bet on the wrong horse, or in this case, the wrong carriage. Still, these struggles were essential. Each failure sharpened the path forward. Steam cars taught lessons about power and speed. Electric cars proved the value of simplicity and cleanliness. Gasoline engines found their niche through range and flexibility. By the early 20th century, the battle had been decided. Gasoline-powered cars would dominate the century to come. It's important to pause here and reflect. None of this was inevitable. The fact that cars became gasoline-powered rather than electric or steam-driven was the result of countless small choices, technological limitations, and cultural preferences. Had batteries been just a little better in 1900, or had oil been less abundant, the 20th century might have looked entirely different. Instead of gas stations, perhaps we'd have vast charging networks by 1920. Instead of the roar of engines, cities might have grown up around the quiet hum of electric motors. But history favored gasoline, and the car became the machine we know today. As we drift further into this story, picture those early days. Imagine a dusty road in 1905, a farmer staring as a strange machine rattles past, coughing smoke and spitting dust. The farmer shakes his head, muttering that such contraptions will never replace horses. Imagine children chasing after it, laughing, while city councils debate whether these noisy machines should even be allowed. It was a time of uncertainty, rivalry, and doubt. And yet, from that uncertainty came a breakthrough, a convergence of invention and production that finally tipped the balance. Cars became more than experiments. They became indispensable. They became part of everyday life. In the chapters ahead, we'll see just how profoundly that shift reshaped the world. But for now, as you breathe deeply and let your thoughts slow, picture the fragile beginnings of the automobile age, the sputtering engines, the brave inventors, the skeptical crowds, and the moment when humanity finally realized it could move faster, farther, and freer than ever before. If you close your eyes for a moment and imagine life before cars, it feels almost like another planet. Streets filled not with honking horns and endless streams of vehicles, but with horses, carriages, and pedestrians. Travel was dictated by muscle power, either your own, or that of an animal. A journey of 10 or 20 miles was a real commitment, often taking most of a day. Visiting relatives in another town? That was a rare event, not something you could casually decide after lunch. The pace of life was dictated by distance. Most people lived and died within a 30-mile radius of where they were born, their horizons defined by how far a horse could trot before it tired. The arrival of cars blew that world wide open. Suddenly, mobility wasn't bound by the stamina of an animal or the schedule of a train. You could leave when you wanted, go where you wanted, and stop along the way as you pleased. That shift in freedom might sound simple now, but at the time it was a revelation. It transformed not just how people traveled, but how they thought about space, time, and possibility. Daily routines changed. Before cars, city dwellers often lived close to where they worked. Walking was the primary method of commuting, with streetcars and bicycles filling in gaps. The car stretched those boundaries. People could now live farther from their jobs and still get to work on time. This gave birth to the suburb, a word that barely existed before cars. Houses spread outward, connected by roads and driveways, each with space for a personal vehicle. The car reshaped not just cities, but lifestyles. It turned privacy, space, and the dream of a detached home into achievable realities for millions. For farmers and rural communities, the difference was even starker. Before cars, isolation was a fact of life. Visiting town might mean hitching a wagon and spending hours on dirt tracks. Cars shortened those trips drastically. Suddenly, rural families could access markets, schools, and hospitals with far greater ease. The automobile helped bridge the urban-rural divide, connecting far-flung communities in ways that had never been possible before. But while freedom expanded, so did inequality. At first, cars were toys for the wealthy, symbols of status and novelty. If you owned one in 1905, you weren't just getting from place to place, you were making a statement. Farmers might resent the city slickers who rumbled past their fields in gleaming machines, throwing dust in their faces. Pedestrians grumbled as streets became more dangerous. Even as prices dropped and ownership spread, cars remained unevenly distributed. Urban areas gained more infrastructure first, while rural areas lagged behind. And, of course, not everyone could afford to own or maintain one, which created new divides. Then there were the unexpected consequences. The very presence of cars forced cities to reinvent themselves. Roads that had been narrow, shared spaces became widened, paved, and dedicated primarily to vehicles. Sidewalks were invented to protect pedestrians from cars. Crosswalks became necessary. Traffic laws had to be written from scratch. Stop signs, traffic lights, lane markings, all of it exists because of the automobile. Entire industries sprang up around these needs: road construction, asphalt production, tire manufacturing, and, of course, gas stations. The car didn't just join society, it restructured it. Even culture bent around the automobile. Think of dating in the early 20th century. Before cars, most courting took place in parlors under watchful parental eyes. But with cars, young people suddenly had privacy. A drive in the country, a parked car under the stars, these became new spaces for romance, adventure, and yes, a bit of rebellion. It shifted generational dynamics in ways few parents were prepared for. The car wasn't just about mobility, it was about independence. Entertainment adapted too. Drive-in theaters, roadside diners, and motels, all products of a world shaped by the car. Road trips became a cultural phenomenon, immortalized in songs, movies, and literature. Route 66 in the United States, for example, wasn't just a highway, it became a symbol of freedom, exploration, and escape. Cars turned the act of travel into a leisure activity in its own right. But with these changes came darker sides. Before cars, accidents did happen, runaway horses, train derailments, but they were rarer and less constant. With cars, collisions became a grim fact of life. Pedestrians were the first to bear the brunt, often blamed unfairly for not yielding to this new technology. By the 1920s and 1930s, cities had to launch public campaigns teaching children to look both ways before crossing the street. Traffic deaths became a modern epidemic, one that continues to this day. Pollution was another unforeseen cost. Horses left behind waste, yes, but cars introduced smog, exhaust fumes, and the beginnings of a fossil fuel-driven climate crisis. Early 20th century cities like Los Angeles quickly discovered that their beautiful skies could be clouded by automobile emissions. Yet the convenience of cars made this a price society was willing to pay, often without realizing just how steep the bill would eventually become. Cars also transformed labor. Blacksmiths, once essential for shoeing horses, saw their trade decline, while mechanics rose in importance. Entire professions vanished, replaced by new ones. The horse-drawn carriage industry, which had employed thousands, shrank rapidly. Meanwhile, oil drilling, steelmaking, rubber production, and assembly line manufacturing boomed. The workforce pivoted to meet the needs of this new machine. In a single generation, livelihoods across the globe shifted gears. The global economy was pulled along too. Oil-rich nations gained enormous power and influence as petroleum became the lifeblood of the automobile age. Countries with access to steel, rubber, and coal found themselves newly important on the world stage. Wars, politics, and international trade would all be reshaped by the demand for cars and the resources they consumed. And then there's the psychological side. The car didn't just change what people could do, it changed how they felt. Suddenly, individuals had unprecedented autonomy. No more waiting for a train schedule, or depending on a horse's health, or arranging carpools with neighbors. With a car, you could go wherever you pleased, whenever you wanted. That sense of control and independence became a cultural hallmark of the 20th century, woven into ideas of adulthood, responsibility, and freedom. Yet even here, inequality persisted. For women, especially in the early decades, access to driving wasn't always guaranteed. Social norms often restricted them, and some even argued women were too fragile for the rigors of driving. But as women got behind the wheel, often out of necessity during wars or family duties, the car became a symbol of empowerment. By the mid-20th century, women drivers were reshaping not just traffic patterns, but gender roles themselves. Children, too, felt the car's impact. No longer limited to the immediate neighborhood, they could now visit relatives, see distant attractions, or move across the country as families relocated. But the flip side was less outdoor play on the streets, which had once doubled as social gathering places. Asphalt took over, and with it came both new opportunities and new losses. If we zoom out, the world before and after cars is a tale of compressed time and expanded space. Where once people thought in terms of hours or days to travel, they began to think in minutes. Where once communities were limited by geography, they became interconnected by roads and highways. The car didn't just add convenience, it rewired human imagination. By the mid-20th century, it was clear that life without cars was almost unthinkable in many countries. Cities sprawled, economies revolved around them, and culture celebrated them. They were no longer just machines, they were central to the human experience. And yet, as you let your thoughts drift deeper tonight, it's worth remembering that none of this was planned. No single person sat down and said, the car will transform romance, change cities, and alter geopolitics. All of that came after the fact. The car was invented to solve one problem, getting from one place to another. But in solving that, it touched every corner of human life. So as you settle more deeply into your pillow, imagine the world before cars, quiet, slower, bound by distance. And then imagine the world after, noisy, sprawling, faster than ever before. Somewhere between those two worlds lies the story of how the automobile didn't just change transportation, it changed everything. When cars first appeared, they were like exotic creatures, rare, noisy, and often mistrusted. Early models sputtered and stalled, their engines backfiring loudly enough to scare horses and annoy neighbors. In the 1890s and early 1900s, if you saw an automobile rolling down a dirt lane, you didn't just glance at it, you stopped and stared. Children chased it, dogs barked at it, and adults either marveled or muttered about that noisy contraption. But what began as a curiosity soon grew into something far larger, a force so unstoppable that within a few decades, it reshaped the very blueprint of global civilization. The spread of cars was uneven at first. In the United States, where vast open spaces practically begged for faster travel, the automobile caught on quickly. Henry Ford's introduction of the moving assembly line in 1913 brought costs down to levels an average worker could afford. The Model T became less a luxury and more a necessity, rolling into driveways and barns across the country. By the 1920s, America was in the grip of a car craze. Families that once measured their wealth in acres of farmland or heads of livestock now spoke proudly about owning a Ford, a Bic, or a Chevrolet. Europe's adoption was more gradual. Roads there had been built for centuries with horses and carriages in mind, winding through ancient towns and cobblestone streets. Wealthier classes in Britain, France, and Germany embraced cars as leisure machines at first, enjoying scenic drives through the countryside. But even here, the tide turned. French marques like Renault and Peugeot, and German firms like Daimler and Benz, were soon producing vehicles not just for elites, but for a growing middle class. Governments began paving and widening roads, realizing that the automobile wasn't a passing fad but a permanent fixture. Elsewhere, the story was more complex. In colonized regions of Africa and Asia, cars were introduced largely through European administrators, traders, and industrialists. They were symbols of authority, power, and modernity, often owned by officials while the majority still relied on foot, carts, or animals. But cars planted seeds. Where a road was built for colonial administration, villages became linked. Where trucks delivered goods to ports, commerce expanded. The automobile didn't just change life for those who drove, it altered entire supply chains, economies, and trade patterns. Wars also played a crucial role in accelerating the spread of cars. World War I highlighted their usefulness far beyond civilian transport. Cars and trucks were used to move troops, supplies, and equipment, proving their worth on muddy battlefields where railroads couldn't reach. After the war, many returning soldiers brought home both familiarity with and appreciation for automobiles. They had seen firsthand what cars and trucks could do under pressure, and they wanted that mobility in civilian life. World War II magnified this even further. Armies relied heavily on trucks, jeeps, and tanks. The Jeep, for instance, became an icon of wartime mobility, later adapted into peacetime vehicles. The war effort also spurred technological advancements, better engines, stronger tires, improved manufacturing techniques that fed directly into civilian automobile industries once peace returned. In the aftermath, demand for cars surged. Reconstruction in Europe leaned heavily on automotive growth, while in the United States, returning soldiers and booming industry combined to create an explosion in car culture. The 1950s highway boom in America was as much a product of victory as it was of necessity. And indeed, highways became one of the defining markers of global automotive spread. In the United States, the Federal Aid Highway Act of 1956 funded the construction of the Interstate Highway System, a massive network of roads connecting cities, towns, and states like never before. This wasn't just about getting people from place to place, it was about national defense, economic growth, and binding a vast nation together with asphalt and concrete. The ripple effects were profound. Suburbs flourished, trucking overtook railroads for freight, and entire industries grew up along exits and interchanges, fast food chains, motels, and service stations. Other nations took note. Germany's Autobahn, begun before World War II, was expanded and admired for its efficiency and speed. Japan, rebuilding after devastation, invested heavily in modern infrastructure that included expressways designed for the rapidly growing domestic auto industry. In emerging economies, governments saw roads and cars as tools of modernization, symbols that they were part of the 20th century's march of progress. But as cars spread globally, they didn't just connect, they also divided. In cities across the world, road construction often carved through historic neighborhoods, displacing communities in the name of modern traffic flow. The needs of automobiles increasingly outweighed those of pedestrians, cyclists, and public transit. Cities that had once been built around walkable squares and marketplaces reoriented themselves around parking lots and wide boulevards. By the mid-20th century, cars weren't just personal possessions, they were geopolitical levers. Nations rich in oil found themselves at the center of global attention, their petroleum fueling not just engines but entire economies. The Middle East, in particular, saw its strategic importance skyrocket. Oil crises in the 1970s made it clear that the modern world was shackled to the automobile. Gas shortages and long lines at pumps reminded people that cars weren't simply conveniences, they were vulnerabilities, tethering nations to distant oil wells and fragile supply chains. Culturally, the spread of cars created shared symbols that transcended borders. In America, Route 66 became the Mother Road, a mythologized highway of freedom and exploration. In Italy, sleek Ferraris and Lamborghinis weren't just vehicles, they were art forms, rolling expressions of national pride and craftsmanship. In Cuba, American cars from the 1950s became enduring relics, still running decades later thanks to ingenuity and necessity. Cars became icons in ways no other invention quite matched, blending personal utility with collective identity. Developing nations embraced cars with equal fervor. In places like India, the ambassador became a symbol of reliability, while in China, the later decades of the 20th century saw explosive growth in domestic car manufacturing. Roads and highways, once sparse, multiplied as governments recognized that cars weren't just transportation, they were engines of economic expansion. They allowed goods to flow, workers to commute, and families to aspire. But the transformation wasn't always smooth. As car numbers soared, so did the problems. Traffic jams became a universal frustration, from New York to Tokyo to Sao Paulo. Pollution darkened skies over major cities, raising alarms about health and sustainability. Yet even when drawbacks became obvious, the spread didn't stop. Cars had embedded themselves too deeply into economies and cultures to be rolled back. They were no longer optional, they were essential. Advertising played its part as well. By the mid-20th century, car companies were masters of persuasion. They sold not just vehicles, but dreams, freedom, adventure, status, family unity. A shiny car in the driveway wasn't simply a machine, it was proof you'd arrived, socially and economically. These campaigns worked globally, tweaking the message to fit local cultures but always tying identity to ownership. A car wasn't just what you drove, it was who you were. And as cars spread across the globe, they transformed industries far beyond manufacturing. Tourism flourished as destinations became reachable by road. Agriculture modernized as trucks replaced horse-drawn wagons for hauling crops. Even warfare adapted, with cars shaping logistics, strategy, and supply lines. In nearly every sphere of human life, the automobile made its presence known. By the closing decades of the 20th century, it was hard to find a corner of the world untouched by cars. Some places were flooded with them, roads packed shoulder to shoulder with vehicles. Others had fewer but still felt their influence, whether in imported goods delivered by trucks or in aspirational advertisements showing gleaming cars against wide-open roads. The car had completed its spread, from curiosity to ubiquity. It's remarkable to consider that within little more than a century, humanity went from regarding cars as novelties to regarding them as necessities. In that short time, they rewrote the rules of commerce, culture, politics, and daily life. The spread wasn't inevitable, it was the product of choices, investments, wars, and ambitions, but once it began, it was unstoppable. So as you continue drifting, let your mind picture those roads weaving across continents, asphalt ribbons binding cities and nations together. Imagine the first sputtering engines growing into roaring highways, the solitary Model T multiplying into billions of vehicles across every horizon. The spread of cars was not just about transportation, it was about transformation. And with every turn of the wheel, humanity moved further into a new world of mobility and connection. When you step outside today, the presence of cars is so ordinary that it feels invisible. They line the streets, hum in the distance, and move in steady flows on highways like currents in a river. Yet this everyday sight masks the extraordinary reality. In just over a century, cars have not only become a dominant mode of transportation but also one of the most defining symbols of modern civilization. They are the threads woven into the fabric of economies, cultures, and daily routines worldwide. The legacy of the automobile isn't confined to history, it's alive in every commute, every delivery, every drive to school, and every cross-country road trip. The modern car is, in many ways, a marvel of engineering and design. Compared to the sputtering, fragile machines of the early 1900s, today's vehicles are sleek, efficient, and brimming with technology. Engines that once struggled to climb a hill now produce astonishing horsepower while consuming far less fuel. Safety features that didn't exist a few generations ago, seatbelts, airbags, anti-lock braking systems, crumple zones, are now standard, saving millions of lives over the decades. Entertainment systems, navigation tools, and climate controls have transformed cars into rolling living rooms, where long journeys can feel almost effortless. But the legacy of cars isn't just about technological progress, it's about the world they created around them. Entire industries owe their existence to automobiles. Think of the oil giants, refining crude into gasoline that fuels billions of engines each day. Or the vast web of tire manufacturers, glass makers, electronic suppliers, and steel producers feeding into automotive supply chains. Auto repair shops dot towns and cities everywhere, while dealerships rise like temples to the cult of the car. Beyond the industry itself, peripheral sectors, from fast food to roadside motels, depend on the presence of cars to thrive. Without automobiles, the global economy would look unrecognizable. Cars have also defined lifestyles in ways we often forget to notice. Suburbia, for example, is largely a product of the car. In the mid-20th century, families could suddenly live farther from where they worked, thanks to reliable personal transportation. Housing development sprawled outward from urban centers, and entire communities formed around the assumption that every household would own at least one car. Shopping malls, office parks, and even schools were designed with cars in mind, with expansive parking lots and road networks baked into their DNA. The layout of modern life, where we live, where we shop, how we work, is inextricably linked to the automobile. There's also a cultural legacy, one that blends nostalgia, freedom, and status. For many people, the memory of learning to drive is a rite of passage, a moment when the world feels bigger and more accessible. Cars have long been marketed as tools of freedom, the open road, the wind in your hair, the horizon calling. These romantic images persist, even as daily reality often involves traffic jams, fuel costs, and endless commutes. Still, the idea of a car as a personal escape machine endures. A teenager with keys in hand doesn't just have transportation, they have independence. Different regions have put their own stamp on car culture. In America, muscle cars of the 1960s and 70s embodied raw power and rebellion, while pickup trucks today symbolize ruggedness and utility. In Germany, precision-engineered BMWs and Mercedes-Benzes emphasize performance and craftsmanship. Japan gave the world reliable, efficient cars like the Toyota Corolla while also sparking cult followings with sporty models like the Nissan Skyline. Italy, of course, remains synonymous with beauty and speed, producing Ferraris and Lamborghinis that are as much sculpture as machine. Each reflects not only national industries but also cultural values and aspirations. Yet the modern legacy of cars isn't all celebratory. For every gleaming highway and scenic drive, there are traffic snarls that drain hours from people's lives. For every sleek electric model, there are aging vehicles spewing pollutants in crowded cities. Environmental concerns weigh heavily on the automobile's legacy. Cars are responsible for a significant share of global carbon emissions, contributing to climate change in ways that have become impossible to ignore. Smog, once a word reserved for a handful of industrial cities, is now a common problem worldwide, largely linked to vehicles. The story of the car is thus not just one of freedom, but also one of ecological cost. Governments and industries have responded in varying ways. Regulations now require cleaner engines, reduced emissions, and more fuel-efficient designs. Catalytic converters, unleaded fuel, and stricter standards have all helped, but the problem hasn't disappeared. In recent years, the rise of electric cars has offered a possible new chapter. Companies like Tesla have popularized battery-powered vehicles, while traditional automakers are racing to electrify their fleets. Charging stations are spreading across highways, and debates rage about the future of lithium batteries and the electrical grids needed to support them. The dream is to retain the mobility cars provide without the environmental burden, but it's still an unfolding story, one with technical, economic, and political twists. Beyond the environmental question, the modern legacy of cars touches social issues. For many, owning a car remains a symbol of success, but it can also be a source of inequality. In cities without robust public transit, those who can't afford a car may struggle to access jobs, education, or healthcare. Meanwhile, car ownership costs, from insurance to maintenance to fuel, can weigh heavily on families. This duality means that while cars connect people, they can also separate them, deepening divides between those who can afford the freedom of mobility and those who cannot. Technology is reshaping this legacy further. Autonomous vehicles, self-driving cars, once the stuff of science fiction, are now being tested on public roads. Ride-sharing apps like Uber and Lyft have already altered how people view transportation, shifting the emphasis from ownership to accessibility. In cities worldwide, car-sharing programs are reducing the need for everyone to own their own vehicle. These shifts suggest that while cars will remain central, the way society interacts with them may evolve dramatically. It's also worth noting how cars intersect with human psychology. For many, driving is not just a necessity but an experience, sometimes stressful, sometimes calming, sometimes exhilarating. The feeling of being in control, moving through space at speed, is unlike anything that came before the automobile. For others, though, driving is a chore, one more demand in an already packed day. Cars evoke a spectrum of emotions, from joy to frustration, and this emotional connection is part of why they loom so large in culture. On a global scale, cars remain entwined with geopolitics. Oil prices still ripple through economies, influencing everything from inflation to international relations. Trade wars often include automotive tariffs, given how significant the industry is to national economies. Automakers themselves are multinational giants, with parts sourced in one country, assembled in another, and sold across the globe. The automobile is not just a consumer product, it's a linchpin of globalization. But perhaps the most profound modern legacy of cars lies in how they've reshaped time itself. Before automobiles, distance meant something different. A 10-mile journey could consume hours, even a day, depending on terrain and transport. Cars collapsed that time, bringing places closer together. They gave people more choices: where to live, where to work, where to visit. Entire lifestyles became possible only because the car condensed time and space. Even with all their flaws, they've become the default assumption of modern life, so much so that imagining a world without them feels almost impossible. As you listen now, you may picture cars as loud, polluting, traffic-causing machines, or as sleek, efficient marvels gliding silently down the road. Both are true. The car is a paradox, a liberator and a polluter, a unifier and a divider, a source of joy and a source of frustration. Its modern legacy is complex, filled with contradictions, but it is undeniably central to the story of humanity's last century. So as your eyes grow heavy, think of the road stretching endlessly outward, headlights glowing like stars in motion, each car carrying its own story. The hum of engines is the background music of the modern world, a reminder of how far we've come since those first sputtering prototypes. And tomorrow, when you step outside and see a car pass by, you'll know you're looking not just at a machine, but at the legacy of one of humanity's most transformative inventions.